One of the other stories that you've tweeted about quite regularly, and is sort of something that many memes basically kind of trying to prevent the story from dying, is the Epstein case. Do you get a sense of journalistic incompetence or journalistic malpractice in that story as well?
Again, when you say journalistic, I mean the composite of the reporter together with the institution for whom they are reporting. It's a little bit like a pigeon constantly flying into some sort of obstruction. It appears to be in flight, and then as the pigeon gets farther and farther across the room, suddenly it's like it slams into some kind of a force field. Now, you and I know that that's probably a description of a glass wall. All right, there is some glass wall that is preventing the Epstein story from being discussed properly. Everyone's interested in it. The questions are basic, and there's a guaranteed story to write. Simply ask the most basic questions of the officials involved and print whatever comes back. Whatever it is, there's no possibility of an uninteresting answer to the central questions. And yet, the central questions are not asked.
And what are those central questions?
The first one is very simple. You have to ask every government that might be involved, was Jeffrey Epstein known to be attached to any intelligence agency anywhere in the world? Then you have to ask, were his pedophile activities known to the intelligence agencies, and was there any kind of tacit approval or understanding, or is there a categorical denial that such techniques may never be used? Now, we have not recorded the no comments, or we don't discuss sources and methods. That's typical in these stories, where you should be able to say, can I at least get a statement that we would never condone pedophile activities to be used for intelligence gathering purposes? All right. The next question. Jeffrey Epstein was supposed to be a hedge fund manager of some kind, and he had extensive offices at a place called Villard House, the former Helmsley Palace. This trophy building is a place that I myself dropped off materials for Jeffrey Epstein to review in connection to a hedge fund matter. What I want to know is, where are the trading records from Villard House? It would be almost impossible to go back in time and fake trading records for a billion-dollar-plus hedge fund. And yet nobody seems to have ever recorded a trade with Jeffrey Epstein. We don't know where he did prime brokerage. There are no financial records that explain his fortune.
Are those publicly available, or should those be publicly available?
I don't even care about that. Where are the records? If there are no records, I mean, presumably this person paid taxes. Presumably this person had to make SEC filings. I don't know. But the key issue is, I don't think there was a hedge fund. When I met Jeffrey Epstein, which might have been something like 2002, before he was charged with sex crime violations in Florida, I did not believe that Jeffrey Epstein was a hedge fund manager. And I, in fact, called my wife at the time, and I said, this man appears to be a construct. And she said, what do you mean by a construct? And I said, it's like they've hired an actor to play a hedge fund manager. But this person didn't behave like the super rich normally behave. He didn't behave like a hedge fund manager behaved. He didn't have any of the substance that you would normally associate with people of that class. I'm not saying he wasn't smart, but he was glib, and he lived essentially like he was Gatsby. I only met him once. It was probably for about an hour or so. But he was an absolutely terrifying person to encounter. It would be surprising to me if I was alone, in that I immediately had the suspicion that I was looking at somebody who had been constructed rather than something that had organically arisen within the financial community. Further questions that need to be asked. Where was Ghislaine Maxwell's passport last cited? Assume that she has one or more passports, and assume that governments record when passports go through a border point. Okay. We should at least be able to ascertain, where was the last point where her passports, or at least one of her passports, were officially seen? I don't know of anybody asking this question. Can we not call up Interpol? Is there no sense in which we can guess where she was last located? What was the last social event at which she was recorded? We don't seem to know anything about this person. Why are we not talking to Les Wexner? I don't understand why these people are not being interviewed or deposed. We have a very strange situation. And in all of these cases, a simple declaration of no comment would be a newsworthy story.
I mean, I'm hopeful. I mean, investigative journalism does take time. I'm hopeful that
You've got to be kidding. I'm going to shut you down on this. It's been over 6 months. This doesn't take that long to get a no comment from the CIA.
I'm not
the
talking
NSA,
about the
and
no
State
comment.
Department.
I'm not talking about the no comment. My point was going to be, given the amount of interest in the Epstein story, there must be some investigative journalists working on it. I completely agree with your points about the no comments. Like that is not being.
I'm sorry. It's not a question of some investigative journalist. We tripped over some enormous structure. We don't know what this structure was.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. The fortune that I think I've seen referenced to something like $600 million. Who with $600 million would make these purchases? You know, multiple jet aircrafts, private islands, a townhouse on 71st Street in Manhattan, a huge complex in the New Mexico desert, property in Paris. It would appear that most of this was intended for display. I mean, in other words, the behavior patterns of Jeffrey Epstein suggest an 11-figure fortune. Maybe high 11-figure fortune. This person appears to be somewhere in the 9 figures. That's 2 orders of magnitude off. Now, I know that very rich is very rich to many people, but, as a person of much, much smaller means, I can tell you that if you hang around with people who are in this stratosphere, they behave very differently depending upon which order of magnitude they're at. And Jeffrey Epstein was at the wrong order of magnitude. He was behaving like a high 11-figure type guy, maybe, with what appears to be a 9-figure fortune.
Yeah, I mean, my point on this is that I don't know where the media interest is, and it doesn't add up that there wouldn't be media interest given that the huge desire for the story that you can kind of see every time you log on.
Any scrap is interesting to everybody.
Yeah, especially given that we already know the links to someone like Prince Andrew, the British royal family. This is potentially one of the biggest stories.
Let's talk about
that has ever happened.
Well, let's talk about the interview with Prince Andrew. What was that? Now, I cannot believe my ears when very intelligent people watch that interview in its entirety and then say, well, he was unprepared, or it was a mistake to grant that interview. I think that that's not true. I think we have no idea what that interview represented. I think that interview was so bizarre and so clearly, it was almost like he was trolling the media who was asking him questions. Was he forced to give an interview and he decided that he would rather go down with the ship and give the world's worst interview? Mm-hmm. Was he realizing that he was completely trapped and that his best strategy was to make fun of the entire process by giving answers that were so implausible that no child would ever believe them? Whatever that interview was one of the most remarkable pieces of footage anybody has ever seen on television, bar none. To not be talking about this and say, we do not know what that interview represented. What was a member of the British royal family, the Queen's son, giving that interview? Was it in Buckingham Palace?
Yes, I think it was.
It was an insane event that happened where nobody came to a conclusion that makes that make any sense. I'd rather leave the problem open. Who was forced to do what by whom that interview would ever be granted? Yeah,
I can remember when it was first announced, having a sort of double take of like, this is not going to go well. And then the actual interview happened. It was like, I
think it went brilliantly.
Maybe.
For us.
Right?
It was effectively an admission that something is so off in the world, something that's so completely bizarre, that thing would be produced. That was some sort of internal conflict. I don't know whether it was between the Queen and her son or the intelligence services or I don't know what. But it was sort of the sense that you have like almost a hostage video where the person has to behave so bizarrely as to send a message. And the message I got is, I'm going to lie, I'm going to fabricate, I'm going to say preposterous things in an effort to just put this to bed in the worst possible way. Like you now all know never to ask me questions about this because I'm simply going to say the most outrageous and insane things that I can possibly think of.
I mean, as I said, it didn't twig at the beginning. It sounded like a terrible idea. But then I guess I rationalized it by thinking he's clearly got no self-awareness. Maybe he did think that he could clear his name.
Nobody's that dumb, David. Those questions were entirely expected. And the answers, if you look at the amount of twinkle in the eye, I mean, he's clearly not a happy man, but he's saying absolutely ludicrous and preposterous things. I think that the effect is exactly the reverse. If I had to speculate, I really don't want to, I would say that this interview was given because an amount of pressure was put on a human being who decided that his life was effectively over in most senses. And this is the way he chose to go out, effectively making fun of the entire process.
Yeah, but what's really interesting is I'm sort of aware, for example, the Royal Television Society Awards were 2 nights ago, the Journalism Awards, and the Prince Andrew interview won Scoop of the Year and Interview of the Year. So it's kind of been rationalized, and I've seen people talk about how they got the interview. The Newsnight producer was trying hard and was on Buckingham Palace, which is kind of ludicrous. The idea that it was just the dedication of the journalist keep continuing to ask for an interview that made Prince Andrew say, okay, you've asked me so many times. I mean, that in itself is kind of a ludicrous narrative, but it is a narrative that the mainstream, I've seen the mainstream media kind of integrate that whole thing into, wow, this is an amazing scoop. You were dedicated and you got the story, which is kind of ludicrous. The idea that, so you see what I'm saying?
I really don't. I mean, I'm so.
What I'm saying is that it's already been rationalized within the mainstream media. The reason that interview happened was because they were so dedicated and they pursued Prince Andrew and they asked Buckingham Palace and eventually they conceded and they gave the interview, which is kind of ludicrous. I'm saying it's ludicrous.
Well, it is ludicrous, yeah. But I guess, I mean, my expectation is that even if the UK is no longer the world power it once was, I presume you still have adults with IQs over 70. How could you possibly rationalize such a thing? I mean, we used to turn to you guys for intelligence and sophistication. This seems the height of folly. If I had to say, this is much closer to a hostage video where the hostage is attempting to send a message that is clearly not the ostensible message on video. The really difficult part of the story, David, is that almost certainly we're talking about some kind of operation that was being run with knowledge of governments that may have involved pedophilia and was not shut down. And what I can't understand is what is it that is keeping some reporter from simply asking the questions that are on everybody's mind? Was this person connected to the intelligence services? Where was Ghislaine Maxwell's passport last seen? Why are we not talking to Les Wexner? Where are the trading records? What is the source of the fortune? It seems to me very clear that we have a missing fortune of Robert Maxwell and an unexplained fortune of Jeffrey Epstein. Are those the same fortune? Who's asking these questions? Did everybody go to sleep when they taught journalism in school? I just don't understand.
I guess my sort of disconnect as well is this sense of, I worked in Channel 4 News, they had an investigative unit. These were the kind of bread and butter questions. They pushed really hard, for example, on the phone hacking scandal in the UK, the Murdoch Papers phone hacking scandal that also involved networks of power, it involved shady deals, it involved corruption, and they pursued that quite intensely. I'm feeling this sense of dislocation because I agree with you, there are these questions that are not being asked, and I find it difficult to understand why that is, knowing that knowing the public interest and knowing that these questions have been asked in the past.
Let me tell you what happened. People started asking those questions and they stopped. And that's what idea suppression is all about. We don't have the resources to pursue that right now. Well, actually, I'm concerned that this is starting to reek of conspiracy theory. I think given the delicacies of the situation, I'm going to need a lot more evidence before I give this thing the go-ahead. These are the sorts of things that you say when you're trying to shut down a line of inquiry. And my guess is that whatever the story is, it represents some very powerful structure that we tripped over. And I tripped over that structure in 2002. And I was convinced at the time, before there was any knowledge about this Florida situation, that this was constructed. I mean, we have a very famous case of a guy named Eli Cohen, who was fitted with a backstory and became a playboy in Damascus and held orgies, if I understand correctly, where he collected information and leverage against people in the Syrian government. If you take that situation, this looks remarkably similar. We've got a guy who was apparently a math teacher at a private high school, and the next thing we know, he's avoided jail in some sort of financial scandal, and he's suddenly set up as a mystery financier with connections to absolutely everyone in the top echelons of power. Something doesn't smell right about the story, given that nobody appears to have ever traded currencies with a guy who was apparently moving billions as a currency trader.
And was this kind of well known within the financial industry at the time?
There were two fortunes that were truly mysterious: Bernie Madoff and Jeff Epstein. In the case of Bernie Madoff, the belief was that he had a legitimate business and an illegitimate business, and he used the legitimate business as a source of profit by front-running it inside of his illegitimate business. That turned out not to be the case. In fact, it was basically a Ponzi scheme. And that leaves Jeffrey Epstein. Now, I used to give talks in the world of finance about how to handle opaque hedge funds, like when they won't give you information about what they're doing. And I conflated Jeffrey Epstein and Bernie Madoff into one slide, and I called it, as a joke, Black Arts Capital, because you had Black Stone and Black Rock. And so I turned it into Black Arts, and their tagline was supposed to be, we'd tell you what we were doing, but then we'd have to kill you. So these were well-known anomalies in New York in financial circles, because...
And when are we talking? What sort of era?
2002, when I met Jeffrey Epstein, when he tried talking to me about currency trading.
So it was well known with financial journalists?
It was well known that the fortune didn't make sense. Something didn't add up. Who is his prime broker? Who was he trading with? Under what name? Where did this money come from? Why did he seem to know everybody? It was like somebody created a Gatsby-like character out of a Ralph Lauren lookalike who had apparently recently been a math teacher at a private high school. Nothing added up. And
is the sense now that even interest in this story kind of marks you out as a conspiracy theorist?
I don't like the question.
But is that your sense?
Sorry. Yeah, okay. No. I'm going to attack the question. Would you mind?
Sure.
Okay. What do you mean a conspiracy theorist? So when I hear nightly on the news that maybe Russia is controlling the American elections and trying to prop Donald Trump up, are those conspiracy theories? When I hear that the coronavirus is in fact under control and then the market falls apart, is that a conspiracy theory? I mean, where are we in history that conspiracy theorizing is a privilege of the people inside the institutional class? No, that's incompetent. We have discovered conspiracies previously in the United States. COINTELPRO is probably the most disturbing conspiracy that we found within the last 50 years. In fact, conspiracies happen and you need to be able to go after them. So I think we should make a new rule. The next person who tries to use the epithet conspiracy theorist, we figure out what conspiracy theory they've been pushing, because frankly, everybody inside of the gated institutional narrative is hawking one conspiracy theory or the other. It's time for this technique of trying to intimidate people by using that epithet to die. And if you want to come after me, be my guest. Do it in print, and let's have some fun. We have to understand that in episode 18, which we were previously discussing, I introduced the disk. The reason for doing it right before episode 19, where I talk about the telomere situation, the Jackson Laboratory and the Grider Laboratory, is that I didn't want to explain what the disk was only. I wanted to show people what the disk is. In a normal world, given the amount of interest in that story, if what I'm saying is untrue, or whether, in fact, it is true, whether what Brett is saying is true or untrue, every possible outcome is interesting. Every possible outcome could sell papers. Ergo, if the thing is not being followed up, and in fact you can demonstrate the amount of interest by looking at the amount of interest on the web, you can figure out very clearly that there is a disk, because nobody would forego that large a number of eyeballs and that many clicks if they actually had a proven story. So in part, the way you understand the disk is to ask what doesn't happen. So for the moment, just imagine that you have two layers. You have a physical and legacy media layer, and you have a digital layer. What is remarkable is the extent to which the physical and legacy layer, comprised of things that exist in the world, institutions, legacy media, ignores this other layer, except occasionally you get sparks between the two layers. And when those sparks happen, you get magic. Now, what I find fascinating is the way in which the legacy media layer is pretending that very smart people with the same credentials that are found in the lower layer are saying interesting things, and there is almost like an agreement to treat them as vampires. That is, when they pass by the looking glass of legacy media, there should be no reflection that something interesting is being said that is gaining adherence. And I think that's what's fascinating to me. If you think about what the portal has done, it's had people like Sir Roger Penrose, the great physicist, on. It's had Tyler Cowen, who writes perhaps the most read economics block, on. Peter Thiel, one of the most listened to voices in Silicon Valley. All of these people are saying interesting things, and yet there's effectively no reflection of what's going on outside of this legacy media arena. So what you have is you have an insular system, that is the gated institutional narrative, and you have an insulating layer, which is the disk, that prevents anybody who's not part of the institutional agreements from saying something super interesting and having it reflected inside of the institutional conversation. And I think that that's what the point of the portal is. How do we find a way to arc between the digital and the legacy layer? Because actually the legacy layer isn't important to me in terms of reaching people. The reach of a Joe Rogan or a Sam Harris or me or Brett or any of these people is more than sufficient to get the news out there. The real importance of the legacy layer is that there is an agreement that we are not going to take seriously that which is solely digital. And so if we can just stick our fingers in our ears long enough or pretend that everybody outside of the Citadel is Alex Jones and Matt is a hatter with a tinfoil hat, then we can potentially pretend that just like in professional wrestling, everything is real and nothing is fake. And that's the new fate of the gated institutional narrative. People are increasingly taking a look at it and saying, there is no telling of the tale that results in what you are currently calling journalism. We are all seeing this extra layer, and you guys are pretending that it doesn't even exist.
Do you think that insulating layer has got more intense since? Because in 2016, you did have like Trump effectively kind of coming out of the online insurgency and changing and winning the election. Do you think that there is more insulation between the digital layer and the...
Oh my gosh. I mean, just look at all of the changes in the terms of service.
Yeah.
So for example, look at the terms of service of Facebook, of Twitter, of Google between then and now. And look at all of the terms we've learned, right? I mean, I think Google had a leaked report called the good censor. I believe that Twitter uses downranked to mean shadow banning. I believe that Facebook uses deboosting. The entire conversation, we now have a doctrine of strategic silence coming out of the Data and Society group about why reporters should not talk about things. I mean, the institutions had a wake-up call, which is Donald Trump proves the power of the digital layer. The people are angry. They're sick of this stuff. Nobody believes in the institutions. I don't think the people who man the institutions believe in the institutions. They're all sick with the same problem. And in that kind of an environment, they've all gone to desperate measures to defend themselves by making sure that they have the means of keeping anything unwanted out of that layer. So before it was an allegation, I'm being shadow banned, and they would say, well, we don't do that. Now that's part of the terms of service. Now, I don't think that there's anything controlling all of the different ways that ideas are suppressed. But the central thesis that I have is that since the early 1970s, period between 1971 and 1973, let's say, something changed in the nature of the world economy. And whatever this change is, we didn't study it enough, we didn't talk about it enough. People will say, oh, I know exactly what that is. It's the Arab oil shock, or it's the change in the relationship to the gold standard. But in fact, something changed character. And that meant that all of our institutions that were built on an expectation of growth could suddenly no longer meet the expectations that were put upon them. As a result, my belief is that we had a universal environmental effect, which is that all of the institutions came to be headed by people who were comfortable in one form or another with distorting the truth. And as the situation went on longer, the heads of the institutions became more aggressive in the way that they would distort the truth to hide the fact that the pyramid scheme that we discussed in your last film was governing everything, that you couldn't get enough entrance into the system in order to feed the system by telling them the truth. All right. So in this situation, what happens? We have a very thorny problem. If people start discussing the idea that things are patterned or built as pyramid schemes, then every single institution becomes endangered. And if one institution is more honest and another one less honest, then the more honest one will tend to suffer. As a result, we became more and more aggressive towards individuals on behalf of our institutions. Dissenters, people who would actually raise the question of, are our universities actually giving a good education and delivering value for the money that they cost? Or is it likely that this law firm has a durable business model? Or is this medical practice too governed by incentives coming from the pharmaceutical industry in order to keep afloat? All of these sorts of questions became very important to suppress. And as a result, I would say lots of different pieces started to emerge that would suppress questioning and suppress disruptive ideas. So in my understanding of this, all of these different complexes sort of began to interweave into a master complex. It was an emergent phenomenon, but because the ideology was universal, that is, every institution was protecting itself from the fact that it could no longer meet its growth expectations unless cheating of some kind occurred. The threat that they all faced was a common threat. That is, that somebody would point out that the medicine wasn't as good as it was claimed, the education was overpriced and didn't deliver enough value, that our representatives were on the take. Whatever the individual issues were, it needed to come to pass that the institutions would be defended generically against people asking difficult questions. So if you think about the period, I don't know, still in the 1970s before this had really kind of solidified and hardened, you had institutions going after other institutions. For example, 60 Minutes and CBS News would take on a corporation that was misbehaving. And so, you know, the old joke is, what are the most frightening words in the English language? Mike Wallace is here to see you. And the entire thrust of that was that you would have institutional warfare. For example, the Washington Post would take on the presidency during the Watergate era. And somehow we now have a gentleman's agreement. When we had the 2008 financial crisis, I think effectively no personnel at the investment banks went to jail. When we had a savings and loan crisis, we did have people going to jail. So as time has gone on, somehow it has emerged that there's kind of a sensibility as the different pieces of idea suppression form a giant complex. And the general feature is always the same, which is that the dissenting individual has to be suppressed or held back by the institution, because it's not right to question an institution that can't actually defend itself on its merits. And I think that, you know, you start to look for this everywhere and you'll find it. For example, on social media, you'll see people talking about deboosting or downranking. In the Me Too scandal, we learn a new phrase that we never heard, catch and kill. Whatever these things are, when you start to hear, well, so-and-so is disgruntled. Oh, why are they disgruntled? Why does that discount their perspective? Maybe we should listen to disgruntled people. What we have is an enormous complex that has arisen from different pieces that are all somehow interoperable because they're all solving the same problem. How do we make sure that institutions that can no longer defend themselves in honest terms are protected from the individuals that would raise the questions?
And you've talked about before the gated institutional narrative. How is the disc different from the gated institutional narrative, or the gin that you talked about before?
Well, in the case of the gin, it is a conversation. So it's the conversation, for example, that the New York Times is having with the Democratic Party, with commentary from The Atlantic and analysis provided by The Economist. So in that sort of institutional conversation, all of the major players are talking. The disc is about the layer that separates that conversation from the conversation taking place outside of this sort of rarefied exchange of ideas. So what if the person who is most knowledgeable about something isn't attached to any institution at all? That person has no allegiances. The individual remains sovereign. As a result, it's very important to make sure that we don't have individuals without institutional supervision or attachment running around and stimulating thought and questions about various topics. So I would say that the gin is the thing that is being protected by the disc.
Eric, thank you very much.
David, pleasure is